And I also want to thank you for showing that TED Talks on Pine Ridge and on Wounded Knee. I go down there every year on a motorcycle ride called the Wounded Knee Memorial Motorcycle Ride. 100 intertribal riders, even white guys come along, which is good because the story of Wounded Knee is not just for the Lakota people or for Native people. But that story that you just saw there is in Canada as well. I've been chief now for going on my 28th year, and I've been on over 100 Indian reserves, or reservations as they call them in the United States. The reserve system, the reservation system on both sides of the border is the same system. The United States people and the Canadian people, going back to when those flags were first created, the history of your ancestors come from the same place. So I'm going to be going over the issues that we're dealing with here in this country now called Canada. But first I have to recognize that we're on the traditional lands of the Okanagan people. In the village area here, for 10,000 years, was occupied by the Penticton people, St. Pekitin people. And it's good to see that more and more when I go across the country, when I sit in boardrooms of all major companies, they're starting to recognize that the traditional issues of the First Nations people were not swept away and cannot be swept away by any prime minister or premier or those people that elect them. Those people that elect the leadership in this country are the non-native people. In the conflict that still happens, not only in the United States, or Australia, or New Zealand, or in all of the Americas, the indigenous movement did not end at Wounded Knee. So I'll be going over some of as one of the speakers mentioned, we got to acknowledge our mistakes. I liked hearing that talk about mistakes. Personal mistakes, sure, we have to acknowledge those and deal with those, but we should also be acknowledging our national mistakes, our provincial errors that we've made. And I'm going to go over some of the myths, like the myths of the doctrine of discovery, the myth of manifest destiny, the myth of the melting pot that the United States and Canada has been trying for over 500 years to put the tribal people of all the tribes of North America into this American melting pot or the Canadian melting pot. Our people have resisted that and will continue to resist that. The other myth is that the founding peoples of this land, now called Canada, is the French and the English. There was no people, there was no human beings here when the French and the English got here, that they are the founding peoples of this land? Any historian would say that's a mistake. Archaeological evidence, your own evidence, your scientific evidence today that the white people use would clearly say that that's a mistake. The other mistake is the honor of the crown, that at every parliamentary session, every time the leadership in this country gathers in Ottawa or Victoria, they talk about the honor of the crown. So I'm going to quickly go over the biggest injustice in Canada is what happened and continues to happen to the First Nations people of this land. That is the biggest injustice that Canada should face and has to face. It is appalling to the Native people when we sit here and we see the leadership of the United States and Canada point their fingers at leaders overseas and point their fingers at the injustices that are happening in other countries, when in their own backyard, most First Nations people are sitting on reservations or reserves with unemployment rates that exceed the Great Depression. In your history schools, in every school they still talk about the Great Depression and how bad it was. I run into people in this country, old-timers, that tell me how bad it was during the Great Depression, that they remember what their grandparents told them, how bad it was. You know, at the highest unemployment rate during the Great Depression was around 30%. The worst unemployment rates that white people have faced in Canada, in the U.S., is around 30%. Yet, as we stand here today, most reserves and reservations unemployment rates exceed 50%. I was in Ontario a few months ago, and they tell me the unemployment rates in some of those reserves are at 80%. And yet, all of a sudden, when something happens in the world, the leadership of this country starts pointing their fingers. I think the prime ministers and the premiers should start looking in their own backyard first. And let's start talking about the greatest injustice that has ever happened on this soil. And I always go back to one of the leaders of the black people. And one of the greatest leaders this soil has ever known is a black leader. When he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." In the books that I've read on when I went to university, all talk about the injustices of the tribes. We're a cross-border tribe, the Okanagan Nation, like all of the tribes that sit along the 49th parallel. The Americans and Canadians put that border there without our permission. Our old-timers always tell us that is not our border. The Canadians and American people cut my people in half. We have 7 Okanagan bands on this side of the border, but we have an Okanagan band not far from here on the U.S. side. So every time I pass this border, and all the Blackfoot people, the Mohawk people, the Cree people, the Ojibwe people, same thing. The Canadians and Americans cut our nations in half. And when I go past this plaque put here by the Rotary Club, an international organization, highly respected organization, I love what this message is. That every person, should use this 4-way test in everything that you think, say, or do. You should always do this 4-way test. First question on any issue is it the truth? And then they go on to, is it fair? Will it build goodwill? Is it beneficial to all concerned? But I want to stay on the first test. If we can't get by the first test, we shouldn't even be going to the other tests. So the first question is in the creation of Canada, in that flag that I see every day on this side of the border. And then when I cross my tribal lands and I go into the United States and I see that other flag, what's the truth? How did those flags come about? What's the truth? The truth is that Indian people were always looked at as an inconvenience to manifest destiny. Indian people were always looked at as being in the way of progress. Native Americans were always talked about. George Washington talked about the Indian problem in his documents, in every president since George Washington. The first prime minister here, John A. Macdonald, talked about the Indian problem. When I went to university, Native American studies, I always read about the Indian problem. That's what the leadership of this country talked about. The fact is, there is still an Indian problem in Canada, in the United States. One of our chiefs said this, is not this true? You cannot discover an inhabited land. Otherwise, I could cross the Atlantic and discover England. If white people can come over here and discover America and Canada soil, then why can't we go over to the French in the English land and discover their land and claim it? That's what was done to us. But maybe these rules only go one way. The fact is, in the Americas, we were called savage people. You read the old newspapers, the old documents by the leadership of the country of Canada and the US. They called us savages. That's what they called us. And they believed that their people had the civilized right to possess our tribal territories. But who really are the savages? I love this. This book is written by an Indian. And the fact is, Canada and the United States, when they created those flags are tainted with millions upon millions of tribal people's blood. Even your Prime Minister here, the founding father of Canada, when he wanted to put the Canadian dream, that railway through tribal lands, he starved our people into signing those treaties. This book that just came out called Clearing the Plains historically documents the starvation methods used by the Department of Indian Affairs. And when the Prime Minister was mentioned to him about the natives are starving on the prairies, he called us beggars. He called the Indian people beggars, and that beggars should not be choosy, and withheld rations so that our people, the Cree people, Ojibwe people, the Blackfoot people, would be starved into signing those numbered treaties. Now our people can read and write, and we're writing our own books now. Harold Cardinal wrote this book called The Unjust Society That Is Canada, and how the Queen's representatives fooled our people. The Queen, we heard stories about the honor of the Queen, and the Queen Mother will look after us. The Queen Mother has never looked after us. The last meeting of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission just happened in Edmonton this past week. Can you believe that? That in Canada, in the United States, they had boarding schools in the US, same thing. They had residential schools in Canada. The most educated people in this country at the time, and Prime Minister after Prime Minister, President after President, authorized boarding schools in the States and residential schools in Canada. And people got paid big bucks to run these schools. People younger than me went to residential school on the Suyus Indian Band. In the Okanagan, our people were either shipped to Kamloops or shipped to Cranbrook. People younger than me. So this is not something from 100 years ago. And to see modern day leaders say that we don't care about the facts. I'm not going to apologize. And it took how long for the Canadian people, the Canadian government, to apologize about the residential school system that the Canadian government put in place for 100 years. Canada can't ignore the First Nation issues in this country. There's still a widespread gap. The youngest and fastest growing population in this country are the Aboriginal people. And I'm going towards self-sufficiency. I don't want this dependency model that has been created by the provinces in the federal government. And we need a shift in focus from Indian affairs towards business development on the reserves. Because the government has never and will never properly look after Indian people. I want my people to have what most people have, and that's a job. Simple equation, better job equals a better life. I'm going to push for that and still maintain my Indianness. It's great to see that the first non-white president is talking about better relations with the tribes. And also, at the foundation of this is to recognize that the founding nations are the Indian people. Maybe we need some karma in all this stuff to happen. Maybe that's what we need. But this Jesse Jackson quote reminds me of what has to happen here in Canada. If you want peace with these pipelines, with these mining companies, and all this natural resource development in this country, then there better be justice. Canadian people better be hollering for justice. And our chiefs have been talking about that for a long, long time. Nobody gave us any rights. That's another myth out there. Nobody gives Native people rights. These are inherited rights. No government gives us rights. So our people will not be idle anymore. The sound of the drum is going to come back to all of these areas, whether it's the United States or Canada. And we're going to work through these issues, this unfinished business, these unfinished treaty issues that need to be worked through. And I ask the Canadian people to uphold the honor that your ancestors talked about, in the honor of the crown that that our chiefs keep on hearing about. Every time when we meet with provincial officials, our federal officials, they bring out the honor of the crown. And I tell my people, we need a different kind of hunter today. A hunter for business. Hunters for jobs. We need the modern education to help us get to the same standard of living that most Canadians and Americans take for granted. And that we need our young people to dream about jobs, to have a dream job. But never to forget, as this Lakota wrote in his book, Custer Died for Your Sins, that this country has been sick ever since the first treaty was broken. Now I'll close off to my TEDx wish. In this whole complicated mess of Native, non-Native relations, and the big complicated problems between the provinces and the states and the federal government when it comes to Native issues, the youngest and fastest growing population in Canada is the Aboriginal people. As we stand here today, over 150 Indian reserves don't even have internet. How is the youngest and fastest growing population going to participate in the Canadian dream? So my wish is that we get those reservations, broadband, and that the kids have a chance to participate. What all of our kids here have in the Okanagan, and that's a laptop, and that's being on the internet. And going back to what I call one of the greatest leaders this country has ever had. The time is always right to do the right thing. So I say, let's do the right thing. The time is now to do the right thing. Limlimt in my language. Thank you.